How does God talk to us? That's what we're going to be thinking about. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, we're going to be thinking about the voices of God. And the first one we'll think about is the voice of creation. It says in Psalm 19, verse 1, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world." And what it suggests is that one thing about God is that he reveals himself. That means he's consciously, constantly articulate. He talks himself out to us. He reveals himself. If God doesn't reveal himself, we can't know him. We can't imagine what it's like to be the creator. We can't really know his character, but one way God talks to us, one of his voices, is visible if you look outside. That the trees, how God has fashioned creation, tells us something about him. So what this is, it's a personal revelation from God, the way he made things. That's what this passage indicates. Day after day, night after night, he reveals himself to us through what he has made. God makes his invisible divine qualities visible in creation. We can't see God. He has qualities that we can't perceive. They're invisible. And what it says, he makes them visible. He's made his invisible qualities visible. One way is this way, through what has been created. It can seem that creation is a second-hand revelation. That it's not really important, but that's a mistake. We learn about God through what he has made. As we'll see next week, God tells us about his goodness through Christ. Tells us about his goodness, and that's what we'll think about next week. But God also is characterized by, I'll call it, godness. Things that are true of someone who is the divine being, and where God tells us about his goodness through Christ, he tells us about his godness through creation. It says the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, his godness, have been clearly seen, being understood through what he has made, so that men are without excuse. Eternal power and godness are clearly seen in creation. The problem that Paul will talk about is to observe God's handiwork and to erase the signature of the one who created it. Here's what it says as the passage goes on. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. They became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds, animals, and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. When we read about individuals involved in the degrading of their bodies with one another, we expect to read that this makes God angry and that his judgment is not far off. Most of us have a well-developed list of do's and don'ts that we've learned through our life. While our lists may differ, one thing that probably would be on most of our lists, as we develop these lists, would be sexual immorality. Not just sex, but sex outside of its proper confines. Whether it be cruising the net or playing the field, we sense that recreational sex, wrenched from the context of a committed relationship, we sense that it crosses a line and makes God angry. We find something really unexpected here in this passage. We read that God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity. God gave them over, delivered them over in the desires of their hearts to sexual impurity. God gave them over to the control of sexual desires. Seems to suggest God gave them over to sexual addiction. Once they were given over, attempts to slam on moral brakes would have no effect. They would continue to gain speed and crash into sexual excess. Sexual immorality is not the reason for God's judgment, at least not in this passage. Sexual immorality is not the reason for God's judgment, not in this passage. It's the result of it. That's what it's suggesting. It's the result of God's judgment. Sexual insanity, increasing enslavement to sexual desires. When this happens, attempts to hold the line will fail. Just say no campaigns, they don't work. If sexual immorality was the result, you'd be careful with that. If sexual immorality is the result of God's judgment, what's the question? What's the reason? What's the reason? It says that in this passage, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse, for although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. They neither glorified God or gave thanks to Him. And their foolish hearts were darkened. You know what it suggests? That refusing to acknowledge God's artistry in creating the universe. That's the reason for judgment. And the result of that judgment is giving individuals, no, it's not individuals here. What Paul talks about when he talks about this giving over, it's not individuals that he's talking about. It's talking about cultures. So inasmuch as a culture tends to erase God's artistry, it's like the universe is this canvas. And you know what would happen if you defaced a painting? If there's a painting and the author puts their inscription on the painting, and if you wanted to, you could erase you would be defacing that canvas. What it suggests, if you look out the window, this is God's canvas. And to erase God's name from being the one who painted it is what this passage is talking about. It's not suggesting, there's all kinds of different theories of how things came to be. Some will say it's got to be 7 literal days that God created the universe, and it really doesn't have to. The important thing the Bible will say, there was this, I forget who it was, there was a scientist who says, some say in the beginning God, but I say in the beginning hydrogen. What the Bible would suggest is in the beginning God. We don't know exactly how that happened. Genesis is not supposed to be a verbatim account. We think Moses probably wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. As far as we know, he wasn't there at creation taking notes. Could you do that again? I missed that. When you were creating the mountains, I dozed off for a little while. So if God, if you wouldn't mind, if you could put that on hold, could we kind of run that back? I said, thanks so much. Yeah, what is that animal? Can I see that? That's not the way it happened. You know what Genesis is? What Genesis is, it's poetry. And what it's supposed to do is tell us things about the beginning of the world. And what Genesis tells us, in the beginning God. Might not have been 7 literal days. That's not his point. But this passage suggests, with respect to the problem, is that because they could easily see God's fingerprints in creation, they refused to acknowledge his handiwork. Although his eternal power and divine nature is visible, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. The passage suggests, again culturally, that the roots of sexual immorality grow out of a culture's belief or disbelief about the origins of the earth. It's interesting. So the result of God's judgment is sexual immorality. But the reason for God's judgment is erasing God's signature from creation. That's what he's saying. It's interesting, isn't it? It's a different take on things. Not assigning to God the role of creator is the root of the problem. Again, I want to be very clear. This is not indicting individuals. So somebody who is caught up in sexual excess, it's not saying that individual it's talking about cultures as a whole. The reason for God's judgment is not immorality. The result of God's judgment is immorality. The reason for God's judgment? Idolatry. Idolatry is failing to assign credit where credit is due, especially as it relates to God. The wonders of nature point to the wonders of God's nature. To look around, see evidence of incredible power, and fail to acknowledge divine fingerprints, that's the reason for judgment in this passage. The rise of sexual immorality in our culture, concerning? However, restoring sexual sanity will require more than a just say no approach. Our culture's inability to honor sexual guidelines is the fruit of the problem, not the root of the problem. The root of our problem is how we view sex. This is the fruit of the problem. The root of the problem is not how we view sex, excuse me. This is the fruit of the problem. The root of the problem is how we view God. We can get involved in nitpicky theological debates, even about how the world comes to be. Is there any evolution involved? God just plunked it. We can get involved in a lot of nitpicky kind of things that not ultimately very helpful. We can lose sight of the basic fact that acknowledging the grandeur of creation and assign it to him. Job and his friends, they were stuck in a debate about where evil comes from. And they really wanted to know, and Job was arguing with God, he couldn't figure it out, and he really was puzzled, and it goes through chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter, and then finally God appears and speaks to him out of the voice of creation. And here's what it says: Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. God answers out of a storm and said through the storm, will you really annul my judgment? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Or do you have an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? It's possible to shrink God without realizing it. Possible to shrink him. There's a book, Your God is Too Small. If your God is out of control, if your God blows people up for leaving this church or that church, your God is too small. If your God goes into a tirade because the wrong political party was selected, your God is too small. God has better things to do than to blow up people who don't go to a particular church or who don't vote along the lines of a particular party. God is much bigger than that. When we think about the bigness of creation, it puts things into perspective. I included an article in here that kind of repeats. I really want to be clear about this passage so that there's no confusion when we leave. So I'm going to read this, and so you can either read it along with me or just listen. And as we close the service, just want to make sure, and then we'll close. It begins with a question from a commentary, kind of devotional commentary I wrote on the book of Romans. It starts with the question, what makes God angry? It's not hard to come up with an answer, is it? Most of us have well-developed lists of do's and don'ts. And while our lists may differ, sexual immorality appears on most of them. Whether it's cruising the net or playing the field, we sense that recreational sex, wrenched from the context of a committed relationship, crosses a line, makes God angry. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, for God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and the foolish hearts were darkened. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. When we read about individuals involved in the degrading of their bodies with one another, we expect to read that this makes God angry and that his judgment is not far off. We find something unexpected. Sexual immorality is not the reason for God's judgment, at least not in this passage. Sexual immorality is the result of God's judgment. We read that God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity. God gave them over to the control of sexual desires. He gave them over to sexual addiction. Once they were given over, attempts to slam on moral brakes would have no effect. They would continue to gain speed and crash into sexual excess. The result of God's judgment? Sexual insanity. Increasing enslavement to sexual desires, attempts to hold the line would fail. Just say no campaigns would be useless. If sexual immorality was the result of God's judgment, what was the reason? God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Therefore God gave them over. The result of God's judgment? Refusing to acknowledge God's artistry in creating the universe. God gave them over because although they could easily see God's fingerprints in creation, they refused to acknowledge his handiwork. The world is God's canvas. Although his eternal power and divine nature is visible in creation, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. like someone who defaces a work of art by removing the artist's signature from the painting. They erase God's name from creation. The reason for God's judgment is idolatry, not immorality. Idolatry is failing to assign credit where credit is due. The wonders of nature point to the wonders of God's nature. To look around, see evidence of incredible power, and fail to acknowledge divine fingerprints is the reason for judgment. The rise of sexual immorality in our culture is a concern. However, restoring sexual sanity requires more than a just say no approach. Our culture's inability to honor sexual guidelines is the fruit of the problem, not the root of the problem. The refusal to recognize God's reality and respond gratefully to Him is the root of the problem. The root of our problem is not how we view sex. This is the fruit of the problem. The root of the problem is how we view God. As we close then, so you think, so what do we do with this? What do we do? God is self-revealing. All of us have behaviors and thoughts and attitudes that concern us. We have a tendency to gaze at our behavior and glance at God. Gaze at our behavior and glance at God enough to see if He's angry with us. Gazing, glancing, gazing, glancing, that's upside down. Don't gaze here. Don't gaze at your behavior. What this passage suggests you gaze here. And to gaze here, one way you can gaze here is to gaze there. God created the world, and you know what He would have us do? Gaze at Him. I tell you a prayer to pray that I pray most mornings. God, reveal yourself to me. Do you want to be who God wants you to be? All of us deal with stuff. Don't focus on your behavior. Focus on Him. God reveals Himself. What about that? Try to switch your gaze and glance. Don't gaze at God's commandment. Gaze at God's commitments. Gaze at nature. Gaze at His commitments. We're going to talk next week about Christ. And God tells us about His goodness through Christ. And that's what we're supposed to think about. So we'll talk about Jesus next week, but for this week. Gaze, glance. When we get our gaze and glance right side up, we start to recognize things about God. And we start to think about them and be thankful for them. And as our vision of God becomes clearer and thanksgiving starts slowly to develop, you know what you're going to find? Your behavior is changing, and you're not even going to be conscious of it. You're going to say, you seem to be shifting a little bit. You say, I've been trying. What have you been trying to do? I've been trying to get my gaze and glance right side up. I've been trying to think more about God and think about who He is, and that's what this passage is indicating. That's the way to find change on the inside. Let's stand for closing prayer. Father, gaze and glance can get upside down. All of us have things we deal with. It might not be sexual immorality, but all of us struggle with things. It's easy to become preoccupied with that, to think that we need to get that out of the way. That's not the way you would have us function. All of us are going to deal with things, and you want us to recognize you. That's ultimately, you want us to gaze at you. One way we can gaze at you is through the Word. We'll think about that next week. But we can also gaze at you through creation and look and acknowledge, boy, you did a good job in creating, because you tell us about yourself through creation. You are a God who is ordered, but immensely diverse. We watch the nature shows and the kinds of animals and plants and topographies and geographies that you create. All of these tell us something about yourself, personal things, that you are creative and very powerful. And as we look at that, we acknowledge it, and we say, God, thanks for the way you are. I can see it in creation. And that's a really healthy thing to do. Thanks for that in Jesus' name. Amen.